Ich hätte gern zwei Fragen gestellt an unseren Sachverständigen Mr. Nadelmann. Welchen Zusammenhang sehen Sie zwischen dem sogenannten Krieg um Drogen, am Beispiel Mexiko, Lateinamerika oder Afghanistan, und der Art, wie westliche Staaten wie die USA oder Deutschland Drogenpolitik betreiben? Das ist die erste Frage. Zweite Frage, die Global Commission hat 2011 ein Ende des Krieges gegen die Drogen gefordert. Welche negativen Folgen hat der Krieg gegen die Drogen für Konsumentenregionen wie Deutschland, Europa oder den USA gebracht? Warum ist aus Ihrer Sicht der Krieg gescheitert und erfordert eine Reform der Drogenpolitik?
Dankeschön. Herr Nadelmann, bitte.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to speak at the Bundestag. I must first offer an impression on the preceding discussion. I was asking myself, you put together cannabis and crystal meth, throw in legal highs, and then you want to have a rational discussion. Okay. And then I say,
liebe
well,
Gäste,
yes.
Just a minute, Mr. Nadelmann.
Yeah.
Liebe Gäste, es ist eine parlamentarische Anhörung und kein politisches Unterhaltungsformat.
Ja.
Deswegen bitte ich Sie, von Missfallens- oder Beifallsäußerungen Abstand zu nehmen. Die meisten wissen das auch.
Okay. But then I thought, would it make sense, for example, to have a Bundestag or congressional hearing on alcohol and tobacco together? And maybe, because they are both powerful psychoactive drugs, as methamphetamine and marijuana, there is some relationship between the two. We see when people try to stop drinking, maybe they smoke more. There's some relationship in the personalities of people who get in trouble with both. Well, similarly, is there any relationship between cannabis and cannabis policy and methamphetamine policy? Well, there is a little bit. I mean, they are both illegal drugs. They are both psychoactive drugs. They are both used by some people in a way that is not harmful, but by other people in ways that are harmful to others. And there is some relationship. I remember a Justice Department study from the US some years ago that pointed out that when there was a somewhat successful repression of cannabis production, outdoor cannabis production in Hawaii, the result was to encourage the production of methamphetamine in homemade laboratories. Similarly, there was research in the early 1980s that when the United States had a massive interdiction against marijuana coming from Colombia, northern Colombia, and Jamaica, the result was a reduction in marijuana and an increase in cocaine, dealers switching to another substance that was more compact, more lucrative, more profitable. So there is some relationship. On the consumption side, not so much. It is true that most people who use heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine used marijuana before, but it's also true the vast majority of people who use marijuana never go on to use heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine. There is now some research emerging from there's now 1 to 2 million Americans who are legal medical marijuana patients, and more research now with why they are there, what they are doing. One interesting observation, a study recently published, finds that a substantial number of people find that smoking cannabis daily, which is not a healthy thing to do, but they find it helpful in reducing or putting behind them their addiction to cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, or alcohol, more serious addictions. So there is some modest relationship. That said, I do believe to the extent we want to have sensible, pragmatic, rational policy, grounded in the notion that we need to both reduce the harms of drugs and reduce the harms of government policies, and that our greatest responsibility as adults is to protect the safety of our children. From that perspective, holding one hearing and throwing all of them in together does not provide the right role model for our young people in terms of rational, sensible conversation. Now, let me now say the broad question that was asked to me, and that was part of my answer there. The war on drugs, and to link it directly with the Global Commission, that effort of the Global Commission began as a Latin American commission. 3 former presidents, Cardoso from Brazil, Gaviria from Colombia, Zedillo from Mexico, all of them from the sort of center-right part of their political constellation. They were persuaded that Latin America was stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, my government forcefully requiring that they participate in the war on drugs, but on the other hand, realizing that what they were being asked to do was to fight against what is essentially a dynamic global commodities market. The international markets in cannabis, amphetamine, heroin, cocaine, other pharmaceutical drugs are remarkably similar to the international commodities markets with alcohol, tobacco, coffee, sugar, precious metals, what have you. If there is a demand, there will be a supply. If you eliminate one source of supply because of bad weather or a blight or a law enforcement success, the supply will shift someplace else. So long as there is a demand, there will be a supply. For Latin America, the realization was that these 2 powerful forces, U.S. government pressure on the one hand for the war on drugs, and on the other hand, powerful economic forces of the sort that made our most influential conservatives, William Buckley and Milton Friedman, say this is ridiculous. The same was being said by people in Latin America from the left, the right, and the center. That commission produced a report in 2009, and they said we need to move in a new direction. We need to learn from the European approach with harm reduction. And we most importantly need to break the taboo. To break the taboo, an open and rational discussion of all options without rhetoric grounded on science, empiricism, public health, public order. That commission then in 2010 expanded to become a global commission. They recruited Javier Solana from the European Union. They recruited Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations. No great liberal there, just a cautious diplomat. They recruited George Shultz, our former Republican Secretary of everything, more or less. They recruited Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Richard Branson, the businessman. Thorvald Stoltenberg, the former defense minister and foreign minister of Norway. He has 3 children. One is a former heroin addict. The other one is the current prime minister, right? I mean, these were very, very distinguished people, most of whom had not spoken while they were in government, but who now felt they could speak the truth. They organized this commission, they got experts, and they came out with a report that pushed very far in the direction of reform. It did not say legalize all drugs. Everybody realized the world is not going to legalize cocaine or methamphetamine like alcohol or cigarettes. But what they did say is to end the criminalization of drug possession. That what Portugal has done 12 years ago has been more successful than what most other countries have done, to decriminalize the possession of drugs and to treat addiction as a health issue. They said that we need to embrace the harm reduction approach, that what countries like Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, Denmark, the United Kingdom are doing with prescribing heroin, pharmaceutical heroin to drug addicts, and the safe consumption rooms, the evidence is clear. There is no more scientific debate. We should expand those programs. They said with cannabis, we need to experiment with different models of legal regulation of cannabis. They said with respect to the low-level drug couriers, the tens of thousands of people, poor people from Asia and Africa, Caribbean, who cross your borders with little bits of drugs in their balloons in their belly or small amounts, to arrest them forever does no good. We have to find another approach because locking them up in prison does more harm than good in most cases. They did not say, with respect to organized crime and drug trafficking, they said the policy there must not be to relax. There we must focus on those criminal organizations that are the most dangerous organizations, the organizations that are engaging in violence and intimidation. We must distinguish between the criminal organizations that may traffic in drugs, but that are essentially nonviolent, and those ones that are violent and intimidating. Those must be the true focus. And finally, they said, with respect to young people, what we must do is provide drug education that is honest and truthful. The way that I interpret that message around young people, when I am asked as an advocate for cannabis legalization, what's your view on young people? I say, you know, my message to my child and to other young people, it's not, did you or didn't you? My question that I have for my child is, are you going to come home safely at the end of the night and grow up and make me healthy grandchildren? That's my question. The question needs to be on safety. Safety has to be the bottom line. When you see the issue with club drugs now, and people, young people, taking all sorts of new concoctions being produced illegally in my country, semi-legally in your country, imported from China, God knows what, and young people are taking them to experiment, right? And probably this is a fad or fashion that will pass, but what I care about, I don't want them to take it. I know many of them will. I want to focus on their safety. So when I see in the Netherlands, or I see in Vienna or in Zurich that the health department sends their officials to the clubs where club drugs are being used, and somebody from the health department tests the drug, and they can tell the person, this drug is this drug is that, and people learn which drug dealers are selling the bad drugs and the adulterated drugs, and which ones are cut with amphetamine and which ones have nothing. Well, it seems to me that's about protecting the safety of our young people. So let me just conclude by saying, as an American who for many years has traveled around the world apologizing for the actions of my own government in inflicting our war on drugs on the rest of the world for the last 75 years, with tremendous harm both outside our country and inside, with massive incarceration rates, violations of civil liberties, and no benefit in terms of reducing drug addiction, to at last see my country playing the role of global leader when it comes to sensible, pragmatic cannabis policies, when you see the rapid transition in public opinion, with now a majority of Americans saying it is time to legally regulate cannabis like alcohol, and most of the people who say that are not cannabis consumers, and a significant number are parents of teenagers, and they are saying the most responsible policy is to legally regulate this. Good regulation is better than failed prohibition. I think that is a discussion that I hope will happen in your country as well. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Also meine Frage an unseren Sachverständigen. In dieser Anhörung haben sich etliche Anzuhörende in ihren Stellungnahmen mit bekannten Argumenten gegen eine Reform der Drogenpolitik ausgesprochen. Was sagen Sie zu den Aussagen etwa zur Gefährlichkeit von Cannabis oder zur These, Cannabis sei eine Einstiegdroge?
Vielen Dank. Ich bitte aber, Herr Nadelmann, sich kurz zu fassen, denn auch der Kollege, der noch gefragt wird von der Kollegin Scharfenberg, insgesamt darf die Beantwortung der Fragen nur 10 Minuten in Anspruch nehmen. Und Kollegin Scharfenberg hat jetzt auch noch das Wort. Bitte.
Ja, danke. Meine Frage geht an die Deutsche Gesellschaft für Suchtmedizin. Da würde ich gerne nochmal konkret wissen, wie Sie das Phänomen Crystal bewerten, auch bezüglich der Prävalenzen unter Konsumentinnen und Konsumenten. Wie schätzen Sie denn die Folgen des Konsums von Crystal gerade auch in Bezug auf die Defizite der kognitiven Funktionen ein? Und zum guten Abschluss, was muss für Prävention und für Schadensminderung denn nun wirklich getan werden?
Dankeschön. Und trotz der offenen Frage bitte ich um allergrößte Kürze. Bitte, Herr Nadelmann.
Thank you. So with respect to the questions about cannabis, let me say first, I agree with some of the comments that cannabis can be an addictive substance. People can become dependent, by which I mean people can become dependent on their use of cannabis in ways that cause harms to their own health and their own lives, right? I think we all can agree that young people should not use cannabis, and especially very young people. We know that the longer you delay the onset of cannabis use, the less likely there is to be a problem, right? That said, the problem of cannabis addiction itself is significantly less dangerous than addiction to other illegal and legal drugs. There has never been an overdose fatality involving cannabis, right? Many of the most difficult problems involve cannabis in combination with alcohol or other drugs. The nature of cannabis addiction is not as debilitating as it is with other drugs. And as was pointed out, the vast majority of people who use cannabis do not, in fact, become addicted. And as I said before, the vast majority of people who use cannabis do not, in fact, go on to use or get in trouble with other drugs or even to become themselves cannabis addicts or regular users. For most people, it is a youthful phase. For other people, it becomes something that is routine and occasional in their own lives. When the issue is sometimes raised, if you legalize cannabis, well, it will make it a bigger gateway to other drugs. But in fact, that seems exactly the opposite of what both the evidence and a rational argument would suggest. When you look at the Netherlands, which more or less legalized the retail distribution and possession of cannabis 30 years ago, a little more, what you find is that they reduced the percentage of young people who used cannabis and then went on to use other drugs. They effectively separated the quote-unquote soft drug cannabis market from the harder drug one. Subsequent research looked at in a number of cities, I think Bremen, Amsterdam, San Francisco. What they found was in the Netherlands, cannabis was sold here, the other drugs by drug dealers illegally over here. In the United States and in Germany, it was much more likely the case that people who sold illegal drugs sold cannabis and other drugs. So that one of the arguments for legalization of cannabis is to reduce the small extent to which cannabis may be a gateway to other drugs. I think also with respect to what Dr. Tomasio said, we need to be clear about the evidence here. I mean, every single independent national commission in the United States, Canada, France, Australia, United Kingdom, to look at the issue of cannabis has concluded that the criminalization policy should be reduced, that cannabis should be decriminalized or legally regulated, right? The studies that come out now, the one mentioned, the New Zealand study, well, the New Zealand study that was cited showed that if you begin at a very young age, use cannabis very heavily, and continue to use it very heavily into your adult years, it may reduce your IQ. It also suggested that if you use heavily as a young person and stop, or conversely, you don't use as a young person, but use heavily as an adult, no impact on IQ. And then there was a subsequent study that cast doubt on the results of the New Zealand study. So one can always pick a study that says this or that. But the fact of the matter is when you step back and do a meta-analysis of all the studies, what you find is, if I may quote here, that cannabis is probably the least dangerous substance commonly used in human history. That is not Ethan Nadelmann saying that. That is the former administrative law judge of the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration in the United States after conducting multiple years of hearings. On the last question of potency, there was high-potency marijuana in the past as well, I remember. Now, the extent to which more cannabis is high potency. Some of that is because of the penalties for growing it, so people don't grow outdoor, they want to hide it indoor, right? But the other issue is this. When cannabis is becoming more potent, that is precisely the reason you want regulation, you want labeling. When people drink alcohol, they want to know, is it 6%, 26%, or 86% alcohol? And most people don't want 86% alcohol, just as most people don't want the most potent cannabis, because most people want to enjoy their cannabis, not get knocked flat on their back, right? The bottom line is, as cannabis becomes more potent, that is the reason that we need responsible regulation. And as more and more evidence emerges that the key ingredients of cannabis are not just THC, which makes you high, but also ingredients like CBD, which are the anti-anxiety, anti-inflammatory portion of marijuana. And as you see, remarkably, that there is a growing market for cannabis which is low in THC and high in CBD. In other words, not making you high, but reducing anxiety. And people are finding this preferable to pharmaceuticals. And now when you see Bayer Pharmaceutical investing in legal marijuana manufacturers in the UK, and you see scientists with no interest in the cannabis laws saying that cannabis and its ingredients are among the most amazing research into the brain today, all of this suggests, let's take cannabis out of the underground, find ways to responsibly regulate it. The sky will not fall. Our children will remain safe, safer, in fact, than they are today.
Thank you. Dann hat